Okay, so we'll get started. I hope you're a little more familiar with the novel by now. Yeah. Any quick thing that you want to tell me? Any first impressions? What do you think about the language of the novel?
Seems like he's thinking in Kannada and writing in English.
Okay, what makes you think so?
No, I don't know Kannada, but
That's a very good question, yeah.
I don't know, especially the swear words seems very familiar.
Yeah, Malayalis and Kannadigas swear in the same way. Okay. In fact, C.D. Narasimha in his introduction, he also talks about the language which is used. He says it's also because he could, get into the heart and soul of Kannada villages, and which is why, he was not using the proper language as the English use it, and he was using, and there is one place where Narasimha draws our attention to that. There are these expressions like, there are so many things which are left unsaid, like this you see, yeah, leave like that. So he was saying, that was also sort of reflecting the way in which villagers speak, not exactly in complete full sentences, but leaving things unsaid halfway through. And he was saying there was also the inability to use certain English words. For example, he was saying cousin is a word which will not capture the exact sense of relationship that they want to convey. For example, there is an instance where somebody is talking about, he is my wife's elder brother's wife's brother-in-law. So what is the one English word that would capture that? Yeah. So Narasimha says that instead of using the convenient term, say cousin or a distant relative, yeah, he resorts to this very old-fashioned way of using. Yeah, but that's a good observation. It looks as if it is not a novel written in English, but as if the thought process had been in a more regional language, and the rendition is in a more global kind of language. That has also been very ironically seen as one of the plus points of this novel, that it doesn't sound very English. Yeah. Any other observations that you made? Also in connection with the reading that you did from the other secondary sources. What do you think about the themes of the novel? Does it talk about any other thing other than Gandhi, nationalist movement? Which are the major national events, part of the national movement which are being mentioned in the novel? Dandi March.
And I guess non-cooperation movement was something we don't. Yeah, don't touch the government.
Yeah. So do you think it really goes well with the nationalist telling of history? Does it depart from the nationalist telling of history in any way? The image of Mahatma or...
No, it's slightly funny that they have, they didn't go through anything traumatic or that they related to his movement itself, or they didn't even know Gandhi personally as such.
Yes, Murthy was Gandhi for them.
Yeah. Murthy was Gandhi.
So,
and anything they did, they said they are doing it for Murthy itself, but not for... They didn't even know why they were doing certain actions, like, what was that? The incidences where they didn't even know why they were, like making spinning, yeah, and those evening, those
bhajans.
Yeah, after the bhajan session, there was this session where they speak about stories and
Harikatha.
So yeah.
So do you think this could have been the case in a number of South Indian villages? Because Gandhi as an event, as a political event, as a cultural event, and also as a social reform movement, that reportedly had repercussions, different sorts of responses from different parts of the country, and that's not even an exaggeration, and this was true to a very, very, very large extent too. There were other undercurrents, that's another thing of course. But do you think this must have been the case maybe in a number of places where they just responded to this call without even knowing what it was for, without really knowing what it was about, without knowing Gandhi the figure, and maybe there were a number of murtis stationed in different parts of the country. One wouldn't know for sure, but again the subaltern historians who started writing against the grain of this dominant nationalist history from the 1980s onwards, they talk extensively about how the peasant movements in a number of, particularly they were talking mostly from the North Indian villages, how the subaltern movements which were spearheaded by figures who were not really followers of Gandhi or not officially part of the Indian National Congress, they were all sidelined to a very large extent, and how the figure of both Gandhi and the image of the Indian National Congress as the sort of force which would oppose the British Empire, the British government. So, all those were slightly exaggerated, so on and so forth. Today what we will do is I will want you to first briefly take a look at what C.D. Narasimhaya, that is also seen as one of the canonical critics of Indian writing in English, how he positions this novel Kanthapura. And then I want you to take a look at how there are alternate readings available from a post-colonial perspective, particularly from the Priyamvada Gopal. This is the work, the excerpt of which I have given as part of your reading material. What is it? Mahatma Magic. So, Priyamvada Gopal's work is titled The Indian English Novel, Nation, History and Narration. There is another one, the excerpt of which I have not given you, Rumina Sethi's Myths of the Nation. So, before we go into that, I want you to know what C.D. Narasimhaya felt about Kanthapura, which is also the critical opinion which was held uncontested for a long time. This has been part of most of the literary histories, this kind of position of Kanthapura. He talks about how there are very few Indians who write about villages, and he thinks, in that sense, Raja Rao has done a wonderful thing by talking about the villages, though he's also accustomed to all the newer things of the towns, the modern ways of life, and irrespective of that, he doesn't find it hard to get into the the heart of the village. And again, that also resonates very well with what the Gandhi's call was during that time, to go back to the villages. And he also talks about how the politics in Kanthapura is not very important, in the sense that he uses this statement: Kanthapura is no political novel any more than Gandhi's movement is a mere political movement. So, this was also the dominant notion for a long time, that Gandhi cannot be seen as merely as a politician. Gandhi cannot be seen as a leader of a political movement. He was much more than that. So, at that level, when he is equating whatever is happening within Kanthapura as not being merely political, he is saying whatever happens over there, you do not have to see it just as part of the nationalist political movement. There is much more than that. In the same way, there was much more to Gandhi's movement. But again, he does not really talk about how that ceases to be merely a political a movement or merely a political novel. He talks about how Gandhi's leadership and in very glossing over way. He takes only very broad strokes when he talks about the nationalist movement or about Gandhi, and about how he this statement. Kanthapura is India in microcosm. What happened there is what happened in many places during India's fight for freedom. So, it is received rather uncritically, the positioning of Gandhi, the way the villages respond. It continued to be like this for a long time. That is something that I want you to keep in mind. And also, Narasimhaya thinks it is a very commendable thing that even before Gandhi is mentioned in the novel, there is tremendous religious activity, and he does not consider that this religious activity is predominantly Hindu. That is dismissed as a very incidental fact. And religion is also seen as an extension of the ancient Indian culture, and one of the ways in which they can also effectively respond to the colonial means of ruling over, because he also believes that C.D. Narasimhaya in his essay, he also believes that along with the Gandhian ideology, this religious basis, both of that went well together in the anti-colonial struggle. And he also recalls that this is like a most normal thing to happen, because it's in the true tradition of India where social reformers have invariably been profoundly religious men. So, all of these things are quite unproblematically accepted about the influx of religion into the political sphere. And this again, by saying right at the beginning, this is not really merely about politics, it's more than all of that. So, it also takes away this compulsion of politics being a so-called secular space, about the need to separate politics and religion. Yeah. So, and this mixing up of politics and religion in the context of the novel is seen as a way in which the novel responds to the true tradition of the country, a very unproblematic acceptance of all of those things. And about how very categorically he states, both the religious bhajans and the national movement have helped the novelist penetrate into the deeper layers of human nature and observe the pettiness, greed, jealousy, and in some cases callousness and inhumanity of the so-called spiritually bent Indian. So, that is the standard kind of Indian which is available, the spiritually bent Indian, who can very unproblematically include both the elements of religion and politics in the struggle against the colonial empire. And about, this is narrated in the age-old Indian tradition of storytelling, and so the language is appropriated to that effect. Even Raja Rao's own foreword to the novel, he talks about, how it's not written in the English tradition, it is in the tradition of Mahabharata that has verses, and Ramayana 48,000, and Puranas are endless and innumerable. And we don't have the the punctuations and the treacherous ats and ons in English to bother us. We do this in our own pace in Indian style. So, the Indianness of this is evoked not just by the author, but also by the early critics who were writing about the novel. And Narasimha also talks about this distinctive Indian sensibility. One, it has got the power to say accommodate religion and politics together, and then it is also a peasant sensibility. So, here we also find that there is this glorification of the village, glorification of the peasant consciousness, and that is also being used as a effective tool to counter colonialism. Yeah. So, which is why he perhaps also chooses deliberately, or we do not know whether this happens inadvertently, Raja Rao chooses to set this novel in a village which is away from all kinds of modern things, except for their engagement, the response to Gandhi. We do not find them in the heart of activity at all. They are really away from all the center in that sense, away from the political center, away from the economic center. They could very well be an isolated, self-sufficient community, and it is so organic that we do not even have to see them as part of the larger India which was struggling against the colonial rule. And about so these are some of the ways in which Narasimha thought this is this novel needs to be elevated as this proper Indian national novel, and it does not bear any kind of semblance to the English tradition. That is written in our own tradition, and the themes that the novel discusses are also in tune with the spirit of the times, in tune with the politics of the times, and in tune with the way in which the nation was, the villages particularly, were responding to the call of religion and politics simultaneously. But I also wanted to take a look at some of the alternate readings available. There are two works, as I mentioned. One is Rumina Sethi's Myths of the Nation, the other is Priyamvada Gopal's the Indian English novel Nation, History and Narration, where they talk about the Indian fiction being a space where there is this overt narration of history right from the beginning. And in order to set the stage for this discussion, in this chapter Gandhi and Literary India, Priyamvada Gopal asked this question: what does it mean that the world reads and believes that it comprehends India through Rushdie and Roy, rather than Kamleshwar writing in, sorry, that is Hindi, writing in Hindi, or Ambai writing in Tamil. Yeah. So, even today there is a way in which the dichotomy between national and regional, even in that nomenclature, it's very much evident. One has been accorded a regional status, while the other is seen more national in terms of the language, in terms of the readership, or even in terms of the kind of themes that the novel, Indian English novel generally addresses. And she says that is not just about the themes, not just about the narration, it is also about questions of privilege, which is associated with English language and the kind of elite status that its speakers, its consumers have in the society. By extension, it works in the space of Indian English fiction as well. And again, within that, he says there is another kind of privilege, another kind of prioritization that is at work. It is not as if all forms of Anglophone writing, that is a term that she uses, Anglophone writing. It is not as if all forms of Anglophone writing are equally prolific and visible. Yeah. And it is only one single and specific genre, as she puts it, the Anglophone novel that has won for Indian writers working in English. That is a phrase that Rushdie uses, the global currency. Yeah. So, this has there is also a way in which we know how today Indian English novel surpasses all kinds of other writings in terms of poetry, drama, and other all forms of output which comes from any of those writers working in English. Yeah. And this also could be attributed to the market conditions, the global visibility that many of these authors have received. Yeah. And very briefly locating the Anglophone fiction in India in a historical situation. She also tells us there is no tradition of its own, no literary historical genealogy or a movement that is inherent to its development or sense of itself. She is not really negating what Meenakshi Mukherjee spoke about, only trying to draw attention to the fact that unlike many other kinds of genres, novel is also a very young genre, whether we take the case of India or the Western tradition, it is a very young genre. So, at all points of time when the novel emerged, there was no specific tradition to fall back on. So, here again it is not as if the Indian English novel invariably relied on the Western traditions, yeah? And it is not as if it could really take off from the native traditions either. So, in that sense she is arguing that there is no specific tradition of its own. And also there is another curious thing which Mehrotra also tells us about how these writers seldom acknowledge each other's presence, except for say Alan Seeley talking about Derozio. Otherwise he says there is very little acknowledgement of each other's presence. In the same way, Gopal also quotes Bill Bufford. He had written an article in 1997 in the New Yorker special issue that most of the leading Anglophone novelists from the subcontinent had never met. They work in isolation, even thousands of miles from their homeland. So, it is not as only in the recent times, in fact, with these literary festivals coming up, there is at least a forum where these writers come together, but even then it is not as if there is like the regional writing scenario, it is not as if they come together often. There are no circles that you can identify very specifically of their own or spaces that they inhabit collectively on a frequent basis. Yeah. And then Gopal takes us to this idea of national literature and how this genre, Indian fiction in English, that has been distinguished from the beginning with a genre which was always preoccupied with history and nation, yeah, and how they come together to shape the idea of India, which is a phrase that Nehru often used to use. And here I also want you to understand that it is not to say that, again, one of the questions that Ranjani asked in one of the earlier, one of the first sessions that we had, wasn't this the case with all kinds of novels that emerged in all nations? Were they not always responding to, or the narrations wherein they always about the nation in some form or the other? Yeah. But here is a distinction that I want you to be aware of. In the case of India, only in the case of Indian fiction in English, we find this marked, pronounced, recurrent and very forceful engagement with the nation right from the beginning of its emergence. If you take the case of regional novel, for example, if you take the case of Indulekha, for instance, which is again the first novel, arguably the first novel written in Malayalam, we do not find that sort of an engagement with the nation. The engagement with a set of other things. Yeah, on Friday, hopefully, we will also have Shruti talking to us about some of the aspects of Indulekha and how the regional tradition is entirely different from the tradition of Indian Indian writing in English. And also from the beginning, the concerns were very, very post-colonial, and in that sense it was trying to engage with the nation from a non-colonial and non-oriental point of view from the beginning. It's a different thing that we can identify different strands of this post-colonialism, and conveniently post-Rushdie is the different post-colonial moment which has arrived as well. And about how English language in India, it has to be seen as simultaneously being rootless as well as pan-Indian. So, this problematic is something, she says, when we look at Indian fiction in English, this is not something about the about the English language in India being simultaneously rootless and pan-Indian, not something that we need to be that we need to feel essentially very proud of, but something that needs to be problematized, because as an offshoot of this this positioning of being rootless and pan-Indian at the same time, maybe some of the politics which are at work in the case of Indian fiction in English as well as regional writing, maybe we will be able to engage with them in a better way. And this nation narration link, she again reminds us it's not an unfamiliar discourse at all. Timothy Brennan started talking about how all nations are narrated into being in 1990 itself, and since then we've had a number of texts, a number of discourses about exploring this link and problematizing this idea of nation and narrative. But she says in the space of Indian fiction in English, what is very pertinent, what needs to be engaged with is the range and variety of the novel's engagement with India as a imaginative concern, how it actively played a role in the from the 1930s onwards to imagine this nation into being. It was as if the onus rested entirely upon them and not on any other genre or any other language. And she tells us what's different about Indian fiction and English. The idea of a modern nation was arguably articulated in English language fiction before literature in other languages began to engage with the idea. As a literary concern, the idea of India was also tied in two other challenges: writing prose and writing national history. So, there was again, this can also be dated back to some of the discussion that the West already had about how prose was the most significant medium to write the nation's story. And here, when it comes to play in Indian fiction in English, it branches out into many different ways and not just about these two challenges. In fact, though she tries to zero them down into these two challenges, we begin to see that it has got a far more impact than just addressing these challenges. And the most significant aspect of this sort of nationalist telling of history, a nationalist telling of in any sort of a story in the space of Indian fiction in English, was that the inaugural moment was that of Gandhi. And this has also been oft discussed in a number of other historical and sociological documents. There is work by Percival Spear in 1965 where he illustrated that Mahatma gave a nation to the country. So, regardless of whether we are in agreement with Gandhi says, regardless of whether we totally accept what Indian National Congress was foregrounding, there is no two way about the fact that Gandhi unified the nation in that sense. And Partha Chatterjee's essay in 1993, he talks about how Gandhism provided for the first time in Indian politics an ideological basis for including the whole people within the political nation, which is what we see in that novel also to some extent, because nobody has seen Gandhi. They have not read anything written by Gandhi. They have absolutely no idea about what happens at the political center, but they are willing to be co-opted into this project, this nationalist project of ousting the colonial empire. Though again, they are not really victims of the victims of colonization. We do not find any direct bearing on them at any point of time in the narrative. Premada Gopal does another interesting thing. She draws her attention also to Gandhi's own prolific prose output, about his capacity to, I like these terms that she uses, his capacity to dramatize himself and also present his ideas with an unerring instinct. And this says, because of this capacity, the Gandhi's image, Gandhi's work had always been the subject of oral and written literature from the early 20th century onwards. Two things that she says came together to produce such a literature. It was not just about the nationalist movement, it was not just about the movement which was going on against the colonial empire. One was a heightened sense of nationalism, which was also giving a sense of being to the nation, and secondly, it was a presence of a figure of such legendary proportions with a penchant for both narrative and performance. This is Priyamvada Gopal's own words. So, here Gandhi emerges as the subject of a certain kind of a novel for a very long time to come. Yeah, and that is no small thing, given the fact that they are experimenting with a kind of fiction. They could have written about just about anything. Yeah? The reason that they choose to write about certain things which are happening then, there is no historical way of looking, they do not experiment with those sort of things. It is not futuristic. They are talking about a set of things which are happening, and they try to record it in the same manner, and also position as the subject a real character, and also trying to present that character, the legendary figure of Gandhi, in a not entirely in the fictional way, which is what sets these novels entirely apart. They do not try to play with the figure of Gandhi much. Yeah, the status Gandhi remains as a figure which is perhaps like forever frozen in history, and they only try to talk about the many ways in which the nationalist movement benefited from that. And Kanthapura is a stellar example of that kind of a writing. And though Gandhi never wrote any kind of a literary manifesto as such, Priyamvada Gopal tells us there is a way in which we can talk about some of his writings as kind of a literary manifesto, and because many of the writers felt that they were actually those sort of articulations were addressing them. Yeah, for example, in one of his journals, he used to write in this journal Swadesh Swaraj. Yeah? So, there he wrote about the need to understand the popular feeling and give expression to it, to arouse among the people certain desirable sentiments and fearlessly expose popular defects. So, the writers thought that they do have a responsibility, to stir the feelings of the people. If they have understood something about the nationalist movement, about what Gandhi is trying to do, it is their responsibility to also convey it through the medium of novelistic expression. So, we do not find these novelists even talking about other things. Maybe for the same reason, there is this, have you heard of G.V. Desani? G.V. Desani was writing in the 1940s. He was located abroad then, and he wrote a novel titled All About H. Hatter. And that is also seen as a novel which predates the postmodern moment. It is a very postmodern narrative. It does not talk about the nation, it does not talk about the concerns of modernity or post-coloniality. And Rushdie has acknowledged that he perhaps learned a thing or two from G.V. Desani and from Tristram Shandy. Yeah? So, this novel was out of print for a long time, and even today it is very difficult to get hold of a copy of All About H. Hatter. G.V. Desani does not really figure in the literary map of India either. He was also legitimately an Indian, because he was also of Indian origin. Yeah? If we take the criteria of they had to live in India, even Raja Rao was not living in India after 1929. So, perhaps the one thing which was operative over here was whether they were talking about the nation, whether they were using the medium of the novel responsibly. Yeah? Because Kanthapura exactly had fit into this mold. Yeah? There is nationalism going on. Here is a novel which would also encourage people to do the right thing at that point of time. So, if you bring in another narrative such as G.V. Desani's All About H. Hatter, one does not know where to fit that in. Yeah? It's neither very Indian, nor does it serve any purpose. Appropriating G.V. Desani's novel does not serve the purpose, just like it would if you appropriate a novel like Kanthapura. It is a definite starting point. It does not have to stutter the storytelling mode that we are on. That is the story of the nation, and in between, yes, Kanthapura also works in tandem for the same kind of nationalistic goals that the others were pursuing. Yeah? And about the foregrounding of these sort of ideas, that freedom had to come from within, the society needs to be cleansed, yeah, and also about using, eventually it becomes not so much about a struggle against the colony, but it gets presented as an opportunity to cleanse and regenerate Indian self in society, yeah, which is why we find a lot of investment on recalling the reform movements, on recalling the need to the need to cleanse oneself, cleanse the society, again keeping in tune with the Gandhian rhetoric of anti-colonialism. Yeah. And Gandhi did have a thing or two to say about the use of English language. If you come to that essay in page 45, towards the end, I think I have given that as part of the material. This is what he believed in. Gandhi's stated view that English language was not beneficial to the regeneration of Indian civilization did not prevent the Anglophone novel of the 1930s and 1940s from evincing a recurrent interest in him and his influence. So, he considered that English language is not beneficial. He also wrote somewhere that it was it may only help to further the slavery that Macaulay had initiated. But regardless of that, it is also important to know that Gandhi was a person who used English quite frequently. He wrote in English as well, and in that sense Rumina Sethi's work, in her introduction she also draws her attention to how Nehru and Gandhi together belong to this polyglot tradition of bilingualism. So, there is also this dilemma which is setting in, not just with the novelists, but also about the leaders who were at the hem of all affairs. And the challenge in writing Kanthapura perhaps was that he had to render this India. Yeah, he was certainly aware of all of these complications which are at work, but he also had to render it in such a way that it would come through as very nationalistic. We are perhaps attributing many things to Kanthapura, but that is how the narrative emerges eventually. And Priyamada Gopal also agrees that it is a successful literary attempt to imagine India, but the problem is at the flip side is that the imagination is from the perspective of a Hindu elite. The impact and what are they reviewing, what are they imagining? The impact that Gandhi as Mahatma might have had on individuals and on the collective psyche of a small village. Yeah. So, this is all the objective of the novelist, and what is the implication of this sort of an attempt that cannot be limited to a political level, that cannot be limited to the story of a village. Yeah. Because here, as one of you mentioned in the beginning, it is as if Gandhi is like a vision. Yeah. Nobody really knows what exactly it is about, but it is important to follow that vision and be in agreement with what that vision is speaking to them. So, there is a way in which the novel deifies Gandhi throughout, and the religiosity of the framework through which Gandhi is presented, his message is presented. Yeah, that is almost unapologetically that is being conveyed to us, and it's also resonates well with the idioms that Gandhi himself used about talking about the Sanskritic Hindu concepts, or she mentions the Hindu religious practices about fasting or non-vegetarianism. All of these things are incorporated into the novel as nationalist elements, and very uncritically as well. We do not have within the space of the novel any voice which is uncomfortable with this sort of a presentation. Yeah, I want you to be familiar with this work by Shahid Amin. Shahid Amin is one of the subaltern studies historians, and he wrote an essay, Gandhi as Mahatma. That was a case study based on the Gorakhpur district in eastern UP, and what happened, recovering certain archival material from the 1920s and 1920-21. So, he begins by the narration of a certain event that happened way back in 1921. Yeah. So, I read from his essay. Gandhi visited the district of Gorakhpur in eastern UP on 8th February 1921, addressed a monster meeting variously estimated at between 1 lakh and 2.5 lakh, and returned the same evening to Banaras. He was accorded a tumultuous welcome in the district, but unlike in Champaran and Kheda, he did not stay in Gorakhpur for any length of time to lead or influence a political movement of the peasantry. Gandhi the person was in this particular locality for less than a day, but the Mahatma as an idea was thought out and reworked in popular imagination in subsequent months. Even in the eyes of some local congressmen, this deification or the unofficial canonization, as the pioneer put it, assumed dangerously distended proportions by April-May 1921. Yeah. So, it was not about whether they knew Gandhi, whether they had read Gandhi. There was some magic about his presence and about the tumultuous fanfare that followed, and and he says there was this rampant spread of rumors about Mahatma's pratap, or the power and glory of Mahatma. and they were also reported in the local press between February and May 1921. Yeah? And here, in this essay, what he does is he samples some 50 elaborate stories of this period, and one I will read out to you. Stories about Gandhi's occult powers. It first appeared in the local press, in the newspaper in fact, in late January 1921. An issue of Swadesh, which announced his arrival in the district, also carried a report under the heading Gandhi in Dream, Englishmen Run Away Naked. A loco driver, presumably an Anglo-Indian, who had dozed off while reading a newspaper at Kasganj railway station in Etah district, woke up from a nightmare at 11 p.m. and ran towards a cluster of bungalows occupied by English and some Indian railway officers shouting, "Man, run, man." Gandhi is marching at the head of several strong Indians, decimating the English. This caused a panic, and all the local white population emerged from their bedrooms in a state of unrest and ran towards the station. The key to the armory at the station was asked for, but could not be found as the officer in charge was away. English women were locked up in boxes and almirahs, and some Englishmen were heard saying, "Man, the cries of J are still reaching our ears. We shall not go back to our bungalows." In the morning, Indians who heard of this incident in the city had a good laugh at this example of English self-confidence. This story first published in the Banaras Daily Aaj, and then story in the sense is a press story, not a fictional story. First in the Banaras Daily Aaj and then in Swadesh, is illustrative of the wider tendency of the times to berate English power and boost Indian power by contrast. The British emerge in tales of this kind as a weak-kneed race, mortally afraid of the non-violent Mahatma. So this is just one among the many instances that occurred only in one district, in Gorakhpur. Yeah? So think about the enormity of this situation. So Shahid Amin also draws our attention to the inability for us now to know what is fact and what was part of such kind of generated stories, again, which is why there's we really don't know where to situate Gandhi at some level, as a political leader or as a sage or as a visionary. Yeah. So one really wouldn't know, because whether he was occupying all of these roles by himself or not, that's how he's been presented in the popular imagination. Yeah. So this novel at some level is also about the effect of Gandhi on the peasant consciousness. Yeah. We do not really get to know about an authorial voice, and we don't even know whether Raja Rao had meant to critique this in some form or the other, but we have very little evidence to believe that. Yeah, given that his own personal stanzas, they all were they could be positioned in corollary with the dominant nationalist sentiments of that time. And in the novel also, whenever people are critiquing Mahatma, Murthy and others, they always rise up to his defense. This is one of the things that Murthy says: it is not for nothing that the Mahatma is a Mahatma, and he would not be Mahatma if the gods were not with him. Yeah. So this sort of bringing together the political and the religious rather seamlessly, and this is not magic realism. Yeah. This is the rendition which was considered as very part of the common sense during that time, and we do have a lot of other evidences to corroborate that as well. Yeah. And in Rumina Zethethi's Myths of the Nation, she pretty much reads a similar kind of a reading, and she shows how history slides into fiction, how historical fiction has more room for speculative imagination, and it also doesn't have to deal with the anxieties of the historian. So she does give some merit to Kanthapura, but she problematizes the novel from different angles. In fact, this work, Myths of the Nation, is a book-length work on a single novel. Yeah? In terms of its methodology, at some point, when you start working on your term paper or your making a presentation, if you want to take a look at the methodology that Rumina Sethi uses, maybe if we have time, we'll even devote one session to talk about how from a single novel she is able to diverge into various post-colonial aspects to bring in many things into discussion only by starting from Kanthapura. And she views Kanthapura as a product of the national intelligentsia, and she says even the studies on Kanthapura could be located as products of a national intelligentsia grounded in the study of English language and literature and co-opted to a large extent by Western thoughts and ideas. If we examine our own critical standards very critically, we would know that we can also very well fall into this category. of a national intelligentsia who is grounded in the English language and literature and co-opted by Western thoughts and ideas. There is a way in which we continue to borrow a number of frameworks from the West to analyze certain texts which are available to us. Yeah? And she also further qualifies this intelligentsia. It remains separate from the subaltern. We are not looking at individuals, we are not talking about one set of novelists or another set of novels, we are talking about the entire institution, which produces certain kinds of novels, which sustain certain kinds of knowledges and critical opinions. Maybe in the post-colonial world we do have an advantage of looking at things from the other point of view as well. So, the context of the study she situates in such a way, she talks about Kanthapura because it is important to look at the post-colonial cultures, not just for interrogating the nationalist history, but in showing how it gets written. So, again with the novel also, it is easy to perhaps to be very dismissive with Kanthapura, to say that he shouldn't have written it in that way, but it is more important and a more useful exercise for us would be to try and understand why was it written in this way. Was this the rhetoric used even to create a nationalist historiography? And I will just read this quote and then we will talk about it. This is from Rumina Sethi's Myths of the Nation. Within the double discourse of nationalism that was both hegemonizing and modernizing, the village was India's answer to Western domination. It symbolized indigenous cultural standards as well as a power of antiquity that could stand up to the modern. So, it was very important to situate the novel in the village, because village was not just a geographical space, it was not just about Kanthapura, it was about what it symbolized, and also about how village also allowed you to talk about the past in a certain way. And this past was always based on the unchanging Sanskrit Indic civilization. We do get a sense of that in the novel as a lot of invocations of religious symbols, religious icons, way in which that is seen as a pristine form of culture which could be used to counter the Western culture. And in this novel we see the real India is constructed by enshrining the novel in Gandhian ideology. Village offers the perfect setting for that, the Harikatha renditions, and all of that gives us a perfect setting to comfortably enshrine the novel in the Gandhian ideology. There is Gandhian ideology, there is this village, and the novel is placed at the heart of it. So, it gives a the novel performs a legitimizing role. The novel also gets legitimation on account of this sort of a narration. So, it works both way. Now, about Rumina Sethi, I am only talking about certain aspects of the novel and what Rumina Sethi talks about. She talks extensively about the village, how there is a possibility when you talk about the village to locate it in a state of permanence and also in a state of cultural stasis, nothing really moves. And also we are given this impression that it is a fairly homogeneous group who are comfortable with the hierarchy which is in place. We are introduced to these different quarters and those are just incidental things. There is hardly anything which would be problematic about the village setting. And here even in Kanthapura it is as if Gandhi is the only event that happens in their otherwise monotonous lives. They do not seem to disagree much about anything. Even when they disagree, there is a consensus about that kind of a disagreement. And the disagreement in terms of gender, in terms of caste, it is all rooted in a certain consensus. And the village also makes it possible to talk about a prehistoric inner world, which is economically self-sufficient. It is an organic community of peasants. So, these sort of novels which set the narrative in a village setting, they are also reproducing the single formula definition. If you recall the village setting in any of the early Indian English novels, we do not find a problematic rendering of the village. So, if you ask me which are those novels which look at the novel which problematizes this narrative, we may have to go back to some of the writings of the Dalit writers, where they see the village as a space of oppression, where they realize that, whether in their memoirs they write about how they had to run away from the village to Bombay to get a life, to be aware of their sense of identity, how the village remains essentially oppressive in terms of its hierarchy, unlike the magical vision that Gandhi had about the village. It also talks about the values imbibed from the family, the village, its caste. It is not seen in a critical way. It's only trying to reform some of the existing customs, yeah, not to get out of it entirely. Yeah, it's not questioning the dominance that the upper caste had. It's only saying, why don't you co-opt the lower caste also into this movement? Yeah, because they also deserve something better. The narrative is placed in such a way that that discourse does not challenge the hierarchy which has been there forever, yeah, from the pre-ancient, prehistoric times. And these constructions, yeah, the problem with these kinds of novels is that they have received favorably. The constructions of the village, the value system which is being propagated, the hierarchy which is being uncritically received, all of this is promoted favorably. And it also is a point of view which is endorsed by Gandhi, because he also believed that Indian cultural identity was rooted in its villages. That was also one of the points on which Ambedkar disagreed with Gandhi. Ambedkar believed that they need to get out of the village system in order to, out of the villages in order to pursue a life which promises them all the good things of modernity, which would ensure them a better education. That the village was not a favorable setting, at least for some sections of the people, some set of people who are also seen as disadvantaged or as part of minorities. So, what is at stake in this sort of a reading in problematizing Kanthapura? So, what do we lose out on when we problematize a work like Kanthapura? When we begin to say that maybe this is not the right kind of telling, we are actually, we are totally disrupting the flow of the narrative. Yeah, then we do not really know where to start from, because it's also about critiquing a nationalist rhetoric which is built on Hindu iconography. I don't know from where this came from. Yeah, it's iconography. Yeah, nationalism built on a Hindu iconography. So we find these symbols being unapologetically and uncritically used throughout these this novel. But again, think about how the religious symbol, the religious images used over here, the religious space, it was not accessible to everyone in the village. That's not really very pronouncedly mentioned in the novel, but we know that's how history had been. And it also ignores all kinds of class divisions and economic distinctions. Things work in a very organic way, yeah, as if nothing can really disrupt the frozen state in which they are. And it also, when we talk about what is at stake, yeah, what is at stake is the notion of a monolithic Hindu identity, which is also a homogenizing and essentializing tendency. This is not something which we can see only in Kanthapura. This is something that runs through most of the Indian English novels, if we look at them critically, and many others have written about it. Yeah, some of those we shall come back to at a later point. Yeah, so at some level, both Rumina Sethi and Priyamvada Gopal, they are also arguing that this novel is an extension of the nationalist ideology, yeah? That the construction of a Hindu national identity was the nationalist solution to unite a people by appealing to a common consciousness in terms of religious practices. Yeah? So, but only when we look at it in a critical way, look at it from a post-colonial perspective, we would begin to see that just like the nationalist historiography, the nationalist mode which was there in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, the fiction was also very surprisingly, very alarmingly replicating the same setting. It was not really allowing the other to come forward. Yeah, it continued the rhetoric that we get about the lower caste, about the only Muslim character which is villainized. Yeah, it all shows that there is a way in which the Indian space of Indian fiction in English, they are also party to this nationalist ideology. Yeah, they are also trying to, either they couldn't see it, but perhaps the more viable reason, the more practical reason that we could go by is that it's again a choice that they made because it works very well. Yeah, rather than putting at stake many other things, because if you think about, if you were Raja Rao, yeah, if you and I were Raja Rao, perhaps we would also think twice before disrupting all of those stories which are dominant. There is no reason for us to believe that Raja Rao was not aware of the dangers in these sorts of narration. He lived abroad. Yeah, he was also one of the recipients of all kinds of these things that modernity was granting to people like him. And also even the personal choices that he makes in terms of, his decision to live abroad, the decisions that he makes in terms of choosing his life partner, they all show that he had at some level come out of those rigid sense of hierarchy. But the novel does not give us that impression at all. In that novel he is still, like one of you said right at the beginning of this class, it looks like he was thinking in Kannada and writing in English. That's not the case at all, because he was, if we had asked him to write in Kannada, maybe he would not have been. About his own sensibilities, about his own training, he talks about how he was indebted to the French thinkers, because during his formative years he was in France for a long time. So he was an Indian legitimately in that sense, but other than that, linguistically perhaps the language which worked well for him was English. So there is a way in which the novel uses nationalism very effectively to create a new kind of nationalist history. It's not as if Gandhi was received uncritically during his lifetime or at later point of time, but if you look at the novels of the 30s and 40s, we get these two things are very predominant. There is this nationalist ideology which is Gandhian and which is also an extension of the Hindu monolithic worldview. So there is this place in the novel towards the end where Nehru also emerges as a character, just like Mahatma is a character, about this hope that Jawaharlal will change it, and this is how Nehru is being talked about. Jawaharlal is like a Bharata to the Mahatma, and he too is for non-violence, and he too is a satyagrahi. But he says in Swaraj, there shall be neither the rich nor the poor, and he calls himself an equal distributionist, and I am with him and his men. It's about Nehru's socialism. We shall speak of it when you are here. And this invocation of the image of Bharata, like Bharata, we worship the sandals of the brother saint. So all of the images which are being used are predominantly Hindu, and that is used unproblematically. It's as if to be co-opted into this mode of nationalism. You also have to understand the lot of nuances which are part of this culture, which is uncritically predominantly Hindu as well. So there are many other ways of looking at this novel, how again when we talk about certain other novels, which will come back to this point, about how Hindu is not just about religion, it's also by extension about caste. At some level it's not even the Hindu is just a convenient term to be placed at the at the forefront, at the heart of it, because both the Paraya and the Brahmin, both of them belong to the Hindu caste, belong to the Hindu religion. But what differentiates Murthy from the ones who are inhabiting the potter's quarter is that there is difference in caste. So this sort of an ideology that the nationalist movement was upholding, that was also glossing over the elements of caste which they thought would be divisive, which is why Ambedkar and Gandhi were also at loggerheads with each other in terms of their political approach towards the Harijans or the lower caste. We call it a day.